Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our last panel for today on the second day of the Berlin Demography Days 2024. My name is Ronja Bachofer. I'm a journalist from Germany, and I will be guiding you through the discussion today. First of all, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write them in the Q&A at any time. You can find the button at the bottom of the screen. It's that symbol with the two speech bubbles. And I will then bring your questions into the discussion, and I look forward to your active participation in this discussion. I will switch to German in a minute. So if you would like to listen to me and the panelists in English, I have good news for you. There's a translation. You can find the interpretation at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the globe symbol. It's right next to the hand, at least on my screen. And there you can decide whether you want to listen to the discussion in English or German. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, jetzt nochmal auf Deutsch.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me repeat in German. Welcome to the last panel for today, but don't be afraid, tomorrow we will have the last day of the Berlin Demography Days 2024, where we have the opportunity to listen to interesting discussions. I'm Ronja Bachofer. I will be chairing the discussion today. If you have any questions or comments on the subject, please use the chat, the Q&A, in the German version it's F&A. You see the speaking bubbles at the lower edge of the screen, and I will then introduce your questions into the discussion so you can have a vivid exchange with the panelists. Today we want to speak about war and health. That sounds kind of a contradiction. Since November 2024, there is a civil war in Ethiopia, and February 2 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Hamas is terrorizing Israel. Since all the time, this is very dangerous for people living in war areas. And today we want to understand the effects of war and violence on the health and situation and the conditions and the mental conditions of people. What are the measures required in war areas? What do we have to do in order to help people who were displaced but have to cope with traumas? I want to discuss this with three experts, which are live here. Actually, we wanted to have 4 panelists, but Natalia Levchuk is missing for personal reasons. But I'm sure that the 4 of us will also provide for an interesting discussion. And I would like to introduce the experts briefly now. Amy Neumann-Volmer is a general practitioner. She has been working for the humanitarian aid organization Doctors Without Borders. She worked in many project areas as a physician in Haiti and the Central African Republic and in Syria. And since 2017, Dr. Neumann-Volmer is part of the board of the associations, and she was also the chairwoman of the board. Mr. Klüsener is head of the department Research, Aging, Mortality and Population Dynamics at the Federal Institute for Population Research. He researched about the survival strategies of young adults in Ukraine from 2000 to 2006, and has a current research work on Ukraine, on mortality differences. And Lukas Welz is executive director of the working associations of Federal Association of Psychological Centers for Survivors of Torture, War and Fight. He works with people who have experienced torture and war. Thank you for coming. A warm welcome to everybody. Ms. Neumann-Volmer, you were working for Doctors Without Borders in Haiti and Syria. I can imagine that the health situation in such crisis areas is a disaster. How do you actually work under such conditions in such places where the healthcare system has actually broken down? Thank you for this kind introduction. Doctors Without Borders work in conflict regions or also in regions after conflicts who are affected by the situation, and in particular in places where the healthcare system has broken down. And once a healthcare system is broken down, it is not so easy to provide healthcare. Not like you can imagine this in Germany. Basic medicine is very difficult to provide. Prevention is virtually impossible. And simple surgical interventions are also very complicated. And that's, of course, our job to provide access to for the most vulnerable people in those regions, and also to provide medical care in those areas. And are those mainly physical problems or also mental health problems? No, probably Mr. Welz can tell you more than myself. But of course, medical care is a holistic approach, and that means that medical care is including diabetes, etc., but also the consequences of traumata, especially in war-ridden areas where people experience violence. They also have affected their mental health, and so we offer trauma therapy and physiotherapy. So it's really a holistic approach for the people who have suffered and from those situations and who are affected. Okay, Mr. Klüsener, you are quite knowledgeable about Ukraine. You visited Ukraine several times. You did your research work there. What was the situation, the health situation like in Ukraine before the war, and what's the situation right now? All together, Ukraine already before the war had to struggle with diverse crises. When you just look at the transformation process, which Eastern European countries have undergone after the breakdown of communism in 1990. In Ukraine, it was the most painful process, actually, apart from this warlike situation in East Africa. Among the Eastern European countries, Ukraine had an especially difficult time to get on its feet economically. And that, of course, also affected the healthcare system and the people. When you look at life expectancy rates, for a long time, those were very low. For men, it's about 65 and up to 75. And for women, it's 75 to 80 years. So especially for men, it's striking how many men die at a very early age. Of course, that has something to do with the crisis situation which we had there before, which led to alcohol consumption and abuse. There is a very intensive AIDS epidemic in the south of Ukraine. So even before the war started, the country was ridden with a lot of health issues, and at the same time, corruption was a huge subject in this transformation process, and that also affects the health situation. So you don't get always the quality which you would wish to receive. And so there are people who are actually not qualified for the job, who are still working in the job, and they can obtain qualifications without necessarily having the capabilities and the skills which come along with that. So those are the challenges of Ukraine for the last decades. And what's the current situation? Can you say something about the current situation there as well? Well, the situation is very difficult, of course. A lot of aid has been provided. But as we know, the war is everywhere in Ukraine. There are, of course, some war areas in the east which are mostly affected, and also the countryside where healthcare has always been more difficult than in the cities, because in the countryside only basic healthcare services had been provided in the past. So you would have to go to the cities in order to enjoy better health care services. Now, of course, it's difficult in the war areas, but everywhere in Ukraine there is war. Anytime you may be hit by the war, even in the highly developed areas in the big cities, where Russia has actually no problem in order to send its rocket or to fire its rocket into residential areas. So at any time you have to expect to be hit by a rocket or a missile. And of course, that is affecting the population as a whole. In the past, when they had the first war in 2014, the war was still concentrated very locally, but due to the internal displaced people, other areas were also affected. But at that time, in many parts of Ukraine, you were still safe. You could expect nothing to happen there. But now, after the total war of aggression, which this is not anymore the case. Mr. Welz, the Russian attack on Ukraine triggered the largest displacement movement after the end of the Second World War. Since the war started, more than 1 million people left Ukraine also for Germany. What is the kind of medical aid which people who are coming here can be getting? So medical assistance for refugees from Ukraine who are Ukrainian citizens is more or less at the same level like the regular healthcare system in Germany, because politically it had been decided that Ukrainian refugees, and you really have to distinguish between Ukrainian refugees and refugees from Ukraine who are not Ukrainian citizens. So I'm talking about Ukrainian citizens who are refugees here in Germany, and they have been put to the same level of healthcare like others, which of course does not mean that refugees get a totally and comprehensive health care. It is just up to the standards as we know from the healthcare legislation. And that's of course the advantage for people who are Ukrainian citizens versus the hundreds thousands of refugees which do not enjoy the same regulations in Germany. And that is why they are really included in regular healthcare, in doctors' offices, etc., and everywhere, which of course does not mean that there are no challenges at all, especially language barriers is a problem. Many Ukrainians don't speak German or sufficient English, and the German healthcare system is actually relatively badly positioned with regard to translation and interpretation pools. Let me just briefly indicate that Miss Natalia Levchuk was supposed to be here with us, but for urgent personal reasons, she had to apologize herself, and so we are just the four of us. Let me come back to you, Mr. Welz. You just addressed the difference between Ukrainian refugees and refugees from other countries. Could you perhaps specify this a bit more in detail? Well, the basis for this is the Act about Services for Asylum Seekers, which had been revised this year, and until February, end of February, this will be completed. And so the services period has been doubled to 36 months, where asylum seekers in Germany will have a very restricted access to social and health care. That access already had been criticized by the German Constitutional Court as being below the international standard. So the court asked for improvement, and the United Nations in autumn last year also criticized Germany for enacting this special act. And this is the basis for healthcare services provided to refugees in this period of 36 months, where you only have restricted access to the healthcare system. And this is being characterized by the fact that, of course, you get emergency services and pregnancy services, etc. But psychotherapy for seriously traumatized people is practically not provided. Theoretically, it's possible, but in practice, it is not implementable because social insurances will certainly not take the costs. And so foreign staff and everything leads to the situation that only 3% or so of the people who would really be in need of such therapy will have to cope without the social security systems. So the lion's share of those people who need therapy and who are refugees, they may access the psychosocial centers, which we also support as the umbrella organizations, and the funding has to come from other sources, project money, donations, European resources, federal donations. But this only ensures special care, but regular care with autonomous therapists is not possible generally.
Frau Neumann-Volmer.
Ms. Neumann-Volmer, you want to the floor. I just wanted to comment on something. I'm also a general practitioner, because you mentioned this healthcare provided to refugees from Ukraine was also very important for pediatrists, and we have been confronted every day by working with these people. And translation or conversation was astonishingly simple with those people. So I actually had I had thought that this would be much more difficult in reality. So we always found possibilities to communicate at a quite a good level. And of course, then when it comes to continuous treatment and therapy, in case of special wounds or treating and traumatized children and adults, it was more difficult. And there, of course, we have to focus on the, of course, it's very difficult if we don't care about them. You mentioned this, that in Ukraine, many of those people don't get therapy. And if they don't get therapy, if many of them don't get therapy, this will certainly also affect us as Doctors Without Borders in Ukraine. Since the outbreak of the war, we had also projects for tuberculosis treatment and pre-treatment, and especially chronically ill people need continuous treatment. And from the medical point of view, it is really an error, a mistake to not continue their treatment. So actually, they are entitled to such treatment. Mr. Klüsener, you are interviewing Ukrainians who are living in Germany. So what is your take on their health conditions? Mr. Welz already mentioned it, that Ukrainians are a very special group of refugees within Germany due to their status, which was given to them, which provides them access to the healthcare system in Germany. In general, Ukrainians who come to Germany are rather a quite selective group, which is highly educated and sometimes has more resources than other groups of refugees from Ukraine, as compared, for instance, those who are displaced within Ukraine and have to cope with very difficult problems, simply finding a home to live, etc. So those who really make it into Germany, who really went across Poland and beyond Poland, are actually a specially selected group, which are in a better condition than others, but of course they are not well off. They also mainly are coming from war areas. They have family members there. They are maybe traumatized themselves, especially at the beginning of the war. It was really bad. There were war activities all over the country, and they were constantly attacked by missiles, and many people were traumatized, which are now here. The health condition, if you interview people, their health condition is okay, but when it comes to children, a lot has to be done, because among the refugees, there is this especially high number of children who need special treatment, special care in order to process what they have experienced and what is still experiencing and what is still happening there in Ukraine. Thank you, Ms. Neumann-Volmer. I know that Doctors Without Borders are also active in the Gaza Strip. I think you personally did not work there, but have you still information on Gaza? Yes, I did not go to Gaza myself for working, not now and also not in the past. But what the colleagues of Doctors Without Borders tell me is that the healthcare system is absolutely in ruins. So people are on the run, and still their areas are being struck by missiles, and so there is no provision of care. There are no resources. They do surgery without any narcotics. So a lot of children are also affected by serious injuries, and the same goes for women. The numbers are known. Everyone knows that. But it's not only about medical care. There's also lack of water, lack of food, etc. Electricity. Nothing of that is there in sufficient quantities, and replacement or replenishment of the stocks does not really work. So basically, we can just appeal to both war parties at war that they introduce a permanent ceasefire, so that we can really provide these people with what they need. So, of course, medical institutions should not be used for warlike activities, and they should neither be targets nor origins of warlike activities. It is a lot of physicians and medical staff also died in these airstrikes, etc. And it's unbearable to see. Actually, those institutions are protected by international law, and we can, of course, have a lot of regulations. If they are not adhered to, our work is actually not necessary, not possible. So, but your work is also distinguishing whether it's Gaza or Ukraine. Is that correct? Yes, indeed. I have to say clearly that most of the citizens, the major part are of healthcare in Ukraine is supported by the own government, by the population, not by Doctors Without Borders. It's just a minimum part. Of course, we have to make sure that people don't get that we have to make sure that people get medical treatment if they, for instance, cannot go to hospital or so. There are also a lot which has been done for transporting seriously injured people from the war areas to safer areas where they can be treated. And we also provide for physiotherapy. We also did some online training for trauma surgery. So we have to adapt to what is needed there. Mr. Welz, I read that only 4% of the refugees who come to Germany may be provided with psychosocial treatment in the centers, but according to the statistics, at least 30% of the population has had trauma experience and don't get the right treatment. How come that there is such a difference? Why can't we help everyone or more people? Okay, I have to come back to the legal basis of our government with regard to refugees. So that is the Act for Providing Services to Asylum Seekers, but also some other social barriers. The basis is that people who are applying for asylum in Germany are tolerated. They don't take part in regular service because costs will not be assumed. There are different regulations, for instance, the empowerment regulation, which is supposed to provide more regular care by extending the asylum period to 3 years. But the government itself actually abolished it again virtually. So then there is the challenge of interpretation and translation. As Ms. Volmer has already described, it always depends of the type of treatment which is needed. Maybe there may be some short translations of medicine or other interviews with doctors. These gaps may be bridged by online translation services, which have been established in Thuringia or in Brandenburg or are about to be established. But of course, it is hardly difficult in a language-based therapy, which is not only requiring simple translation, but also mediation of concepts and ideas, but also feelings such as shame or fear. And there is, of course, a major safety and security need. They want to know who is in the room, people who experience torture due to their maybe political activism, which had been prosecuted for political reasons. And of course, they have a major interest in knowing who is listening, who will know my story later, who is receiving information. And all those are factors which cannot be provided by regular healthcare. And on top of that, I'm referring to independent therapists, and they are sometimes having reservations to treat seriously traumatized people who come out of a context of torture, abuse, sexual violence, warlike activities, but also experience on the run. And those are factors which cannot be treated with any psychotherapist, where normally they are treating interrelational issues and conditions. So, of course, they might be lacking the knowledge and sometimes also the courage to overcome their own resilience. And to a certain extent, it should not be healed. There are some racist attitudes among doctors as well. We know this from different regions in Germany, where regular treatment by therapists after the war of Russia against Ukraine and the initiated refugee movements, therapists told us that we can imagine to work with refugees, but only if they come from Ukraine. And we don't work with other ethnicities. So on the one hand, there is the legal framework, which makes it extremely difficult to provide full coverage by regular services. And we have to say very clearly, the politicians and lawmakers are preventing this deliberately in order to avoid pull factors for Germany. Again and again, we have debate from the right-wing populist area, also by the chairman of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, when he launched this discussion about Ukrainians getting their teeth done in Germany. And this discussion provides so-called pull factors to escape into our social systems. But when we look at medical practice, there is no validation to prove that. There is no proof for this. People who come here are rather the people who experience torture and violence. And on the contrary, they sometimes are even afraid and they are ashamed to use these kinds of treatments. And on the other hand, Germany, as a value-based society, is also obliged and also under international treatment, such as the Anti-Torture Convention and the German Fundamental Law, etc., and many other obligations, which could be broken down, the Convention on the Rights of Children and other legal framework conditions to which Germany actually has taken obligations, but they are not fulfilled by providing them equal access to these rehabilitation options, for instance, in case of torture, etc. And as a consequence of that, the costs will also rise because, as we said, or as we could see already, when mental health conditions getting chronical, also due to the lack of provision to the accommodation in mass accommodations. So costs for the government will become higher due to the lack of involvement, and so that people might need this assistance for much more a long time by the social system rather than by providing them the necessary care immediately and on short notice. And due to this chronification, there is a rising part of people who have to be treated in hospitals. So there are different disciplines of employees, social workers, psychiatrists, who have to ensure and want to ensure provision or healthcare, but there will be an increasing number of suicidal conditions, etc. And as a consequence of that, suicide rates will increase, and psychiatric treatment, which of course is much more costly, will also increase. And my last point perhaps is the much increased administration effort, which is produced, and the financial effort for the local authorities due to this interest in lowering this supposed pull factor. And we could see in some studies during the last year that this could not be confirmed. Costs for administration will increase, and in the long run, also costs will increase for society and the government, apart from the costs which we as a value-based society have to assume in order to provide indiscriminated access to healthcare systems.
All right, thank you. Now let's talk about refugees who live in Germany or other secure countries. You have now mentioned a few problems: the specialization, focusing on refugee and flight experience, language barrier, racism on the side of therapists. These were just a few. How can they be addressed? How can all this be resolved? What steps are needed? And this is a question to you, but certainly also to everyone in the group. Well, I believe this is a long way to go. Of course, racism cannot be eradicated overnight in a society, also not through just legislation. In the long run, perhaps also with a view to the occupational training of social and health skilled workers, it makes sense that the reality we're living in, and also which includes hundreds of thousands of refugees with their health needs, to be anchored in the curricula more strongly, so that they are open to more people to becoming active in these fields. Very practically speaking, through this short-term funding, always focused on budgetary years, that is funding through the psychosocial centers, for example, we have the situation that this very straining work environment through these severe and heavy topics, but also through the societal environment, when I think of rural regions, for example, where it is also a commitment to work in this field. So this straining environment also has it that one doesn't have a real working conditions for health care workers where you know in December that you have in January still a job. So in the long run, many people are pushed out of this field because they're saying this is not a professional prospect for me to commit myself to this. And of course, the legislative framework must be correspondingly modified, but all political debates at both national level in Germany, but also the reform of the European asylum system point into a different direction. And this is why we cannot really be hopeful in this respect, but we do, of course, try our best to improve these frameworks and also cause changes in this or other respects. Okay, now let's take Ukraine as an example. The whole population has a trauma of war it needs to grapple with. Even if this war reaches its end, there are these many people who are traumatized. How can this trauma be overcome? Mr. Klüsener, could you say something about that? Yeah, I would like to follow up to what Mr. Welz said as far as the health system is concerned, and this issue that the health system can, of course, not perfectly take hold. That is not just only applies to refugees, but also to the general population. Many Germans often only enter the system too late, once they have already become multi-morbid, and only then treatment starts, which makes it expensive too. So this is a fundamental problem our system has, that we don't rely on prevention very much, not as much as other countries may do. And these are fundamental problems. And additionally, then there are language barriers in other persons, and there are no incentives to take more time to deal with people and commit themselves. If, for example, languages would have to be learned which are more complicated. Eritrea, for example, is a classic example where no one has trust in anyone. And if then there is an interpreter in the room, there will always be the question, will they be on my side or on the other side? Which is completely in the way of a therapy sometimes. So these are many problems. And without these language barriers, we have many problems anyway. And then there are all these aspects on top of that. And this is difficult for every country. It's not something you can just do away with overnight. But it is important, of course, to have data on that and to look into these matters and see where can starting points be found to improve that, because the consequential costs are, of course, there. For the person as such, it's not nice that they have a disease which is not treated. And of course, it not just has consequences for them, but also for their environment, potentially also for the society. If these persons, become criminal or whatever. And so these are things we need to look into. But these are really very long-term issues to address. Of course, we can set incentives to do a few things, but of course not individuals can shoulder the whole suffering also in the healthcare sector. This requires systemic approaches to really make progress. What could such approaches, systemic approaches, look like? I'm not enough of an expert to say that, but maybe the other colleagues can say something on that. Yeah, I just see that Mrs. Neumann-Volmer raised her hand. Yeah, I would like to approve what has been said. It's really long-term issues we need to address, but practical experience is there. We could also help people in a way with dignity. We could avoid accommodating people in mass housing. Treating traumatized people, it is also possible to treat people in groups. In Nuremberg, for example, there was someone cooperating with the university. So refugees could also become self-efficient and enjoy treatment in these contexts, which helped refugees to be themselves committed to their integration into the society. So we shouldn't neglect that. And primarily, if we could ensure legal flight routes so that these people are not traumatized by violence when they are on the way to this country. Additionally, this would also be very good. Now, a direct question to you too. We now took a very direct look at what happens to people who flew to Germany, what happens to them here, and how can we help? What are measures which are required in war-stricken areas or in crisis areas? Well, many measures have already been taken. The Ukraine crisis, for example, came up very surprisingly for many. So that there was a total war of aggression from the side of Russia. It seemed to be coming, but one was not really well prepared. And in the first few weeks, this was noticeable. Many things were improvised. One tried to send drugs by parcel campaigns. And over time, we noticed that this has stabilized. The aid organizations adjusted their resources to ensure such care. And it also works astonishingly well. Ukraine is surrounded by secure countries, and this is always helpful, namely that from Poland, from Romania, there can be a concerted action to send medical aids and drugs. And there are still enough people who are ready to go to Ukraine. There are also areas where international persons partly don't dare go because it's not safe enough. So Ukraine, in this very bad situation, is still faring relatively well. And it is still ensured that drugs can get there, that there is a certain healthcare kept up. Also, there's a functioning state still in place. So there are many things which in other crisis areas of the world do not exist in this way and make it even more difficult to provide care to the people. You were just saying the attack came quite suddenly. How could one have prepared in a better way? Or how is it possible to better prepare in the future? Well, this is a psychological and political question. Of course, we don't want to paint crises on the wall. I mean, if around a country that has not been attacked yet, if you set up an aid structure already, you create the impression that something happens there. So in this sense, it's very difficult. I believe it is important, and it did, in fact, work quite well, this rapid changeover. And these many aid organizations are also well prepared for responding quickly to crises. And I think it's impossible to anticipate everything. Mr. Welz. A very brief point. In the past years, I also had the opportunity to be in Ukraine frequently and work there, also during the occupation, but before this full war. And we, as an umbrella organization, especially in Eastern Europe, we have taken several measures where players are strengthened. And I think this is something that could be placed in focus in the long run. It is important that there is this acute humanitarian aid also through international aid organizations at the same time. We, to a certain extent, also need to focus on qualifying the people and structures on site. So we have oriented our program such that psychologists in Ukraine now deal with topics like war, trauma, or how to deal with addictions in the context of war, in returning soldiers, for example, or other factors which have so far not been part so much of the curriculum of either training or work. So we're qualifying them and skilling them in the post-Soviet regions, that is, people from former Soviet states, Belarus, exiled Russians. Human rights activists are strengthened by us in Caucasus, for example. Things are being set up which in a very specific sense, and this is a little example, but may epitomize that. In the current war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, despite all the conflicts and wars which have been there, also after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we want to stay in touch and see how we can learn from each other, especially in the situation in Azerbaijan. The region of Nagorno-Karabakh saw that many Armenians had to flee, and the structures in Armenia itself were not prepared for this large number of internally displaced people in this case. Well, following up to what you asked beforehand, we haven't yet talked about that, namely the transgenerational consequences. We know at the latest from research and practical work with Holocaust survivors what transgenerational consequences such an experience of violence has and can have also for whole societies. And this is perhaps also one starting point of explanation, which is relevant in the situation in relation to Gaza, Israel, Palestine, also Ukraine. Experience with violence in Ukraine has, for example, had it that there was a very strong and sudden migration movement also because of previous experience with Moscow, if I may say so. And there too, it's important to focus on that. On the one hand, the family systems. In the context of asylum seekers in Germany, we had addressed that. For example, if the parents are not in a situation to care for themselves, they cannot care for their family members either. And the same applies to the descendants, the children, which partly are brought into that situation where they have to take the role of the parents, have to shoulder responsibility very early, and which also can have long-term mental and spiritual consequences, which we should not lose sight of. Now, let's also take a look into the future. War and conflicts are on the rise. We've already talked about that. But also natural disasters will, in the scope of the climate crisis, become more frequent. Do we have to expect that the health status of people worldwide and generally will deteriorate ever further? Well, if I may say that very briefly, I don't believe I don't think it has deteriorated. If we take a look at the past 150 years, it's often so, and we should forget that. I wouldn't formulate it this way, but what is absolutely safe is that the climate change and the accompanying crisis will lead to conflicts because there is a scarcity of resources, there's no water. So this means this climate change is a cause for conflicts and will also cause displacement. There will be inundations and an increase in other disasters. And this in turn too lead or may lead to epidemics and may lead to the increase of other diseases. We now have 9 minutes left on this panel, and I would like to give all of you the possibility to wrap up with a final statement. What do you take home with you, and what are your ideas for how health in war areas and also for refugees in safe regions can be strengthened and guaranteed? Well, so let me begin. I would say let's implement all the contracts we have already signed as a country and also as a continent. As it has been mentioned, all the things we have in place is just to be carried out. This is one of the most important steps into the right direction. What we haven't yet addressed is the special situation of refugees, of women and girls in war conflict areas. It's very close to my heart to say that this vulnerable group of girls and women need special protection in this situation, in this situation of conflict. Women experience sexualized violence during the conflict, but also during refuge. And this group needs special attention. Yeah, let me continue, if I may. The title of the conference was also comprising the term crisis a lot. And crisis is a very comprehensive term, which can be interpreted in many different ways, because every person can have a different understanding of this term. I believe what we experience and live through this simultaneity of crises, both outside our own environment, also here in Germany, in our society, in families, groups of friends, personal crises, whatever. We see an increasing reality of crisis as a status rather than an exception. Equally, war also becomes a status. We describe that on the basis of the example of Ukraine, where you're not directly are forced to live at the front or are a soldier. Basically, there is war in the whole society in Ukraine. It's a status to which you may adapt, and you may adapt your everyday action, but also the systems change. And this is something where we in Germany also have to get to with regard to asylum seekers and people seeking protection, that there is this dichotomy of defending ourselves against that and also needing inward migration. Rather, we have to say we have the situation, and there are hundreds and thousands of people who are entitled to be here. So all kinds of court proceedings are going on, which also demonstrates that. So it is our task to apprehend them and integrate them into our health care system, not just in the clinical sense, but also in a wider sense. This is increasingly recognized, namely that health is more than just the clinical treatment, especially also in the field of trauma work. It is about making available a safety, a social environment, prospects, and also recognition of the fact that traumatizing and violence experiences like war experiences cannot just be forgotten, but they will always stay part of the life of people. But we have to create systems in such a way that people can find support. And in the end, if all individuals are supported and they have equal rights to such help, and they are helped, and we as a society will not just benefit on the basis of our values, but if we help one, also this society is helped with regard to all the consequential costs. That is, the burden for the future is not as high. Yes, that's right. Thank you very much. Mr. Klüsener, would you like to finish off? Well, yes, I'm usually an optimist, and here I would also like to strike an optimistic note to end with. It's of course true that the international solidarity is always extremely important in crisis situations because the countries and the societies as such often don't have the resources to deal with all these healthcare challenges on top of all the other crises. So this is why it's important that there is international solidarity, that there are enough countries which have these resources and are ready to make these resources available. These are important prerequisites. And overall, I also believe, and I would also like to consent to what Ms. Neumann-Volmer said, we have made good progress in health. For example, we can talk much more openly about mental illness today. This has something to do with the fact that there is no more a taboo on these diseases. 40 or diseases which were not part of the statistics 40 to 60 years ago can be discussed today, which helps us make progress. At the same time, we get the feeling that people are sicker, but perhaps this is not the case. But it's just that we can talk more about it, like the crisis in Ukraine. 60, I mean, nearly 100 years ago, there was a huge famine, which had millions of people die, and no one noticed. They had to eat grass, etc. Without us in Germany, 1,000 kilometers away, knew about that. So today we know much more about these crises, and this is why we have the feeling there are many more crises, but in fact it's just often just the case that we have more information. This is also something we have to include in our conclusion. Is it getting better or is it getting worse? And overall, I believe we do make progress. People have longer lives, but there are still many points to address, and we have to do that. Thank you very much. A very heavy topic to finish this day off, still on a positive note. So many thanks for this. Ladies and gentlemen who have joined us. Oh, Ms. Neumann-Volmer, she raised her hand. You want to say something, right? International solidarity, that was the trigger for me. It only works if we have access to all these people who need this help. That is, the humanitarian organizations must get access at the places where they are needed. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Vielen Dank, dass Sie das noch
That's
geteilt haben.
absolutely fine. This was very important. Thank you for sharing that. So this is now the end of this panel discussion. Thanks a lot that you joined us and joined this discussion. I'm taking a lot with me of that discussion. This was the last panel for today, but we will continue tomorrow. Also, we are going to have 4 panels tomorrow. It will be about how we prepared for crises, how visionary institutions and solidarity between the generations can be created, and about a world totally without crises. Let's see whether this is possible. So I will definitely follow that. So thanks for joining the discussion and for listening. It was great fun for me, and I wish you a nice evening. Bye-bye.